All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Folks, hear me in the back? Fine? Everything okay? All right, it's a really pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for having me down. I'm presenting some work today that is unfinished, just to give you a warning right up front. This is I like to present work that's not finished so that I can get feedback from you. That's sort of the whole point. Otherwise, I would just send you my papers, right? So that means the ground rules are that there's nothing like sacred here. So you should stop me and interrupt me as you need to. Whatever you think is useful is useful. We'll go as far as we're going. I tend to have much more material than I can get through. My solution for that is usually to talk faster than most people can listen. You're smart people, so I suspect you can listen quickly, but if not, feel free to slow me down. If not, you're not smart, but if not, I'm going too fast, then just slow me down. So I like to start as best I can, if we can get this to work. There we are. Yeah, with this quote by Peter Bligh. Peter Bligh is a social theorist, for those who are not sociologists. He's one of the old heads in social networks from the 50s. And he says, to speak of social life is to speak of the association between people. They're associating in work and in play, in love and in war, to trade or to worship, to help or to hinder. It's in the social relations been established that their interests find expression and their desires become realized. This is, if you will, sort of the strong program in social network analysis, right? The idea is that what it means to be a human critter is to be connected to other people, unlike my machine, which can't seem to be connected to the rest of the social. There we go. So the idea is that I worked for Peter for a while when I was first starting graduate school, and he would put it more colloquially by saying the difference between a gourmet and a glutton is company, right? So what it means to be a human critter is to be connected to other people, and what we want to do as social scientists is understand what those connections look like. And there's a basic duality here that if what it means is to say that a person is the intersection of who and how they connect to other people, then what we want to do is, from the ground up, build not just models of what people do as if they're given, but try to figure out how the social structure is emergent from what people are doing and how they're making connections. So that's the overall plan. And to do that, we want to think about it really in two ways. On the one hand, we think about the strong connections and context that people are embedded in, constraining people's actions. On the other hand, we want to think about how people's actions reconstruct sort of from the ground up the network as we're living in. This is known in sort of by lots of different names. In sociology, it's known as the structure-action problem. It's this basic dualism of people and their structures. And the solution out of this is really to have this notion of structuration, that we sort of build models for how people connect to other people. And so what I want to do today is sort of spend a little bit of time describing how that might happen in adolescence. So the grand goal of this paper, when it's all said and done, if I can actually boil it down to a single paper, is going to be to try to build a model for understanding how kids develop socially and how they use that social development to change the connections they have with others, and how that reproduces sort of in its own way this constant structure that I'm going to try to tell you that we see often. I'm going to convince you of, hopefully, that we see in lots of places. So that's sort of the big picture idea. Under the hood is a model that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about basic micromechanisms that generate social relations, right? And so these are some basic properties that we think occur a lot of time in social networks. These are things like reciprocity and hierarchy and clustering. I'm going to leave those in the background. I'm going to not talk specifically about what those mechanisms are. I'm going to take them as given. If you want to talk more about them, I'm more than happy to. We've done a lot of work on them across these kinds of networks. What I'm going to focus on today is really a more descriptive task of taking these new data we have and sort of trying to sort of show you sort of what they look like. This is also a part of a side project that I have, which is that I think sociologists and a lot of social scientists spend way too much time on models and not enough time on description. And so I'm trying to do is what I consider a quantitative ethnography, to really give a detailed understanding of what these things look like from the point of view of each of these settings. And so to do that, I'm not going to show you a lot of tables. I'm going to do this almost all graphically, all with displays and distributions, because I don't really care so much about testing a hypothesis about a difference between two means. What I care about is understanding what the distributions of these properties look like across these settings. And so I'm going to do it in way too much detail, but I'm going to focus on sort of four things. I'm going to talk a little bit about where ties come from. That's going to happen incredibly fast. Like you get one slide on that. I'm going to spend a little more time on popularity structure because I think that's important, and this is one of the key elements we're trying to explain, the consistency of popularity structure. All the bulk of today, because I think it's more interesting, is going to be on these role positions. This is a new area that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. It's sort of the connectionist models of social science that we deal with. And then if there's time, we'll talk a little bit about peer groups and movement between peer groups. Okay? So that's the basic structure. This little key you're going to see up in the corner all the time, so you can sort of see where we are in this basic outline. But again, stop me if you feel like it. So that's the basic intro. I'm going to jump into data and then jump into findings. Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? I said I talk fast, so you're more than welcome to like jump in at any time. All right, so the data we're dealing with is this wonderful study. It's called PROSPER, which is a crazy acronym for Promoting Health and Social Good. I don't know what the acronym stands for. I can never remember it. But it's one of these things that somebody spent way too much time thinking of. But they're really great data. It's 27 towns, supposed to be 28. We lost one. We didn't lose it, but they didn't participate. And it's embedded in experimental design. We have 14 towns in Iowa, 14 towns in Pennsylvania. The one thing to know about these towns are these relatively small rural settings. And we follow these kids over time in a panel design where we have multiple schools. We have in each school, we have 2 cohorts that we start in 6th grade. We follow them up to the next year, and we introduce the 2nd cohort, and we follow all of them forward to ultimately to 12th grade. The data I'm going to show you today go through 9th grade because we just got the data in for the 11th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade at just the beginning of this year. So eventually we'll be able to continue this out forward. One thing to keep in mind is that there are lots of different underlying sort of contexts that these schools are set in, right? So we have kids in elementary school, they go to a middle school, and then from that they go into high school. In some cities, in some of these towns, we have lots of elementary schools that feed into one high school. In other places, we might have one high school that feeds, one elementary school that feeds into one high school, and so forth. All of that variability, I'm sort of pushing to the background. You're not going to see a lot of that. But you have to imagine that it kind of matters, that as kids are friends with each other, as they move through time, we have new kids entering and so forth. And again, we can think about that specifically. So a little bit on tie type and more important, tie stability. So this is group-to-group contact, right? So this is the gender of the nominator and the gender of the respondent. This is consistency rates over time. So about 55% of same-gender relations are retained 6 months later, and only about 40% of ties are retained a year later, right? Those are for same-sex ties. For cross-sex ties, you get about 40% within 6 months, and only about 25% of cross-gender ties are retained a year later by the time you get to the 4th and 5th wave. So what this is telling us is that the level of the dyad, there's a huge amount of turnover, right? These relationships are churning continuously. So if you're thinking of what it means to be a friend in high school, especially for young kids, this is a lot of turnover from space to space. Moreover, go ahead, please. These are information about someone. Yeah, so we don't actually have them geocoded, but they're really small towns. And so these are towns that have only one high school in them. And the high school class, the biggest school we have is, I think, so these are within grade networks. The biggest school is like 200 kids, right? So we're not talking like giant schools, right? So they probably are aware of each other. They're also mainly white. These are rural parts of Pennsylvania and Iowa. Right? So this is a finding that you all know. You see it in other ways, right? The populated distribution of these networks always has this long right tail, right? So there are some kids who are very popular, other kids that are not. That's true both in the 6th grade. It's true by the time you get to the 9th grade. It's true across males and females. So this is a constant macro pattern of a skewed in-degree distribution. But what's interesting, of course, is that if you turn around and look at the popularity of kids by themselves, what we see is a massive amount of variability across time. So for example, only about 4% of kids are in the most popular quintile all 5 waves, right? And fully 50% are in the top quintile at least once. And so what this tells you is that if you're worried about your adolescent sort of being unpopular at one point, just wait a year. They'll be popular the next time. Go ahead, in the back. This is in degree. This is just the number of times they've been nominated as friends by somebody else, okay? So like I said, fully half of the kids are in the top 20% of kids who were named as a friend by someone else at least once over this period, right? Again, almost 43% are in the least period of popular time. So during this time period, kids' total number of sort of recognized friends varies radically, right? And so this kind of churn tells us that kids are, experience lots of mobility in terms of their sort of local level popularity, which is a little bit hard to square with this kind of a model of a constant distribution of popularity we see lots of places, right? If it's the case that, rich football playing boys tend to be popular, then they should be popular from year to year to year. But that doesn't seem to be the case, right? They seem to be moving over a lot. So that's popularity structure. I want to think about another way to think about popularity structure. And to get there, I like to think about triad distributions. I refer to triad distributions as a periodic table of social elements. This is the thing from which social relations are built up, right? And the nice thing about triad distributions is they allow you to think about structuration in the sense of how I act to one person into the context of a third party. Please. Yeah. Yeah. We would hope that would be true, but it turns out that these results are almost exactly the same in Ad Health, where we have thousands of kids in the schools. So this type of piece, I think you're right. What you tend to find in small schools actually is a slightly longer tail to the distribution. So the more popular kids are, in fact, a little bit more popular in our smaller schools in Ad Health than they are in our larger schools. And I think that has to do with the social visibility. It turns out that even in the school of 1,000 kids in Ad Health, the most popular kid only has about 30 friends. Right, and so I think this really has to do with this notion of social visibility. There's only so much that you can sort of be out there with other people. But it's a good insight, but it seems not to be the case. It seems to be that this pattern is by and large true across schools of very different sizes. Where it's going to matter is the group mobility, and hopefully we'll get to that at the end. So the beauty of triads is that you can think about not just what two people do in a dyad, but how they do it relative to a third party. And so you can build in social rules on top of patterns and triads. So for example, if I think the social balance matters, that a friend of a friend should be a friend, that means that I favor these patterns over patterns where a friend of a friend is not a friend. The other nice thing about triad distributions is the mathematicians have done a lot of work thinking about the distribution of triads and the macrostructure it has to imply. So because every network can be decomposed to the total number of triads that are observed within that network, you can ask if I'm going to forbid, if I have a rule against intransitive triads, then I shouldn't see those, and that should constrain the structure of the global network. And what we find, for example, is that if you constrain it in particular ways, then you get particular kinds of macrostructures. And what's nice about this work is that it allows you to characterize the macrostructure without identifying the macrostructure. So I don't have to identify who's in the top clique, who's in the bottom clique. I know that if the distribution of triads overrepresents these particular elements and underrepresents the others, then the likelihood is that I have a ranked cluster structure of some sort. And I could have 5 clusters, I could have a dozen clusters, but the overall macrostructure has this topology, which is nice. And what we find in the adolescents schools is that the kind of macrostructure that seems to be more often observed than not are these kinds of hierarchical clustering structures. And what's nice about these clusters, these are weak intercollected mutual chains as opposed to strong chains. So essentially weakly connected components linked asymmetrically in multiple levels. And the kinds of, when in the young kids, what we find are typically 2 groups, right? Any basic ideas what the 2 groups are in young kids? Male and females, right? And so in high school, you shift away from this kind of model more towards this kind of model when boys and girls start recognizing they're not yucky anymore and they hang out with each other. And so what this, I'm going to skip that for now. And so what the goal is to get to this kind of pattern by thinking about the distinction between being in a group and being in a role, right? And so to get there, we need to get from triads to roles, and that's where I want to go next. So imagine I give you this network, right? And so we have 2 nodes, they exchange romantic love, and they feed 3 people who fight with each other. Any idea what kind of place this might be? Right, and so without telling you, we know that we have parents and children, right? And so the basic insight behind role modeling in a block model sort of proportion of roles is that we can move from the pattern of ties to a way of being, right, without actually knowing what the way of being is. Now, in an ideal world, you do this with the kind of data that they've collected in the NetCanvas project, where you have lots of different types of relations. But you can do the same thing if you have a single type of relation. And you do it by thinking about the involvement people have within these triads, right? So if you think about how each person occupies a position within a particular triad, we can then aggregate that across all the triads they're involved in simultaneously, right? And so if you can imagine a simple toy example here, right, where we have an undirected edge, so I'm going to throw away most of the triads here because they're undirected, but what you discover is that the people at the top occupy a certain pattern of ties that are different from the people in these other relations. And so if all I know is your position in each of these triads, I build a vector that describes your distribution across all these positions. I can then cluster that on how similar you are to others, and I can generate roles. So it's a really nice, simple way to generate role patterns. I thought I was really clever in graduate school. I invented this model. I was getting ready to publish it, and then discovered Ron Burt had did it 10 years before I started. So that's a lesson to the graduate students to read the literature before you invent a new method. But it's a great way to get at this because it allows you to see a role structure quite nicely. The problem that I have with it, applying it to this work is that the typical way the sociologists do block models is they'll fit a model and they'll decide, well, it should be 4 clusters or 5 clusters or 7 clusters, and you dig deeply into each setting and try to figure out what's there. But I have 300 distinct networks I have to apply this to, right? So I need some way to automate this process. And so what we do is we first generate the similarity matrix on each school, and then apply a hierarchical clustering model. I use Ward's minimum variance is the method that I particularly use. But then at each level, I calculate a modularity score to figure out within each school where I should cut the clusters. So within each school, with each setting of the network, I generate the similarity score, I cluster it, I partition it at one point, and I call that the set of clusters in that school. And so that's great. Right now I've gone from having 300 schools to having something like 2,000 clusters across the state and no way to compare them one to the other. So we need a second layer of clustering. So this is what it looks like within each school. And I might have in one school 7 clusters. In another school, I might have 3 clusters, right? So the extent to which I say that cluster A is like cluster B requires me to then go to the second level where I take each cluster profile and I compare that to every other cluster profile across these 2,000 to end up generating a similarity of cluster profiles, right? So that's the second layer clustering on top of that, in which we identify sets of groups. Now, at this point, I want to step back for just a moment and say, what kind of groups might we expect? It turns out that if you're thinking about these local level role positions, there are really 3 features that interact that a person can play with. On the one hand, you have the sheer volume of ties. Are you engaged in lots of relational activity or little relational activity? You have reciprocity. So if I'm the kind of person that makes a friend, do I expect that person to return their friendship nomination? Or do I expect hierarchy? Am I the kind of person that prefers to get more ties than I send? Right? This is a basic 2x2, but only 3 divisions. So you have 8 possible cells effectively. And this is the types of pieces, of roles that we might expect adolescents to occur out of this setting. So at the top, we have something like what James Coleman referred to as a leading crowd. Right? These are people who have lots of ties, right? They have high reciprocity, and they're highly respected by other people. They receive ties from people that they don't respond to. On the other hand, you might have something. Sorry, wrong direction. You might have something. Does this thing work? Like this, right? Where you have people who have lots of ties, but they're a close-knit group of friends, and they're not recognized by outsiders, right? And so you can go through each of these settings and describe what they might look like, and there are lots of different roles here, and I'm going to describe them in more detail when we get to the other side. But on the flip side, you have kids that are on the outside. So the basic division is between sort of core and periphery, and then within each of those sets, you have different specific patterns. So you go through this different kind of clustering set of about 2,000 different clusters, and you try to sort of map them onto these positions. And it turns out that the maps works really well. You get one set of groups that pops out quite nicely as the people I would refer to as popular loners. These are kids that other people like, but they don't make any nominations in school. Odds are good that this is a data issue. Odds are good that their friends are outside the school. Right? These are kids who are friends with dropouts or with other kids who are not in school or something like this, right? 6th graders don't have dropout friends, but the idea is that they might be above grade or something like that. Continue on. We have more group on the peripheries. The hanger-on group is kind of nice. These are kids who send lots of ties but don't receive them, and the people they send to tend to be more popular than they are by a fair degree. Moving into the more core type positions, so this first split is really between periphery and core. Within the core, you have a set of groups that I refer to as these federated friends. These are a friendship pattern that has to do with having lots of close ties, right, but not a lot of external nominations of people outside yourself. You have a group of people I refer to as lieutenants. Right? These are people who receive lots of ties, but they don't reciprocate those ties. They nominate people who are even more popular than they are. Right? So these are people who would like to be to have some level of popularity. They're sort of in that second tier. And then, of course, you have you keep moving this through. You have a group that maps quite nicely to what people we would refer to as a leading crowd. And so the way I do this mapping is I go through and literally look at the overrepresentation of each of these triad positions in each set, and this is the way it seems to pop out. Now, what's nice about the role positions, so this is the set of final role positions I've settled on. There are 9 of them? 8 of them. Sorry, 8 of them. And what's nice about having 8 fixed positions is that they're constant from wave to wave, right? And so in terms of modeling mobility or activity in one of these settings, I don't have to worry about matching whether or not I go from 8 clusters at time 1 to 16 clusters at time 2, which is what the problem was with group mobility. So role mobility is actually kind of nice because the role structures tend to be relatively constant. Your occupancy for them might change. All right. So first, a little description of what kinds of roles, what kind of occupants, what kinds of kids occupy each of these roles. The first thing that you're going to notice here, so that I've labeled each one. The basic division here is from core to periphery, if you prefer to think of it that way. And by and large, the thing to keep in mind is that kids of all different types occupy all different types of roles, right? That's the main story. There's some margins at the edge, right? So poor kids are less likely to be in the leading crowd than rich kids are, for example. So the likelihood of you getting school lunch is, if you receive school lunch, you're less likely to be in this sort of leading crowd position. There's some sense in which kids who are at the core of the school like school more than kids who don't, and so forth. But the big story is there's lots of variability in each of these features around what might otherwise be a mean story. Similarly, if you ask the likelihood that you and I are in the same position as a function of us occupying the same other kind of attribute, there's almost no predictability, right? So the fact that you and I are both poor or both rich or both smart or both like school or dislike school doesn't predict the likelihood that we're both in the same position. And this is important to keep in mind, right? Because position is a way of forming relationships. It's a way of occupying a friendship structure. It's not what we do together, right? So you can be king of the nerds, right? You can be the guy who runs the Dungeons and Dragons club and make sure that all that happens, right? And have lots of other friends that see you as really cool, right? That no one else who plays football likes, right? There's lots of distinctions between different groups. This is a pattern of ties, a way of relating, as opposed to what you relate about, which is going to be really important when we get to the description of groups. So this is the basic structure of the kinds of kids. You can have lots of these different positions. What does it mean to occupy this position over time? What are the dynamics of this? If you model this is a simple mobility table, right? From from the fall of sixth grade to from the fall of the sixth grade to the spring of sixth grade, there's a fair amount of movement, right? So kids tend to move within blocks. So there tends to be a block of sort of the core mobility, but a lot of circularity in there. But you get a fair amount of movement. If you then move on to the next wave, the next wave, the next wave, what you find is that the mobility tends to be at less. People become more and more stable in the type of role they occupy over time. There's still some mobility, and we can explain why kids move from one place to the next, but the basic story is that as kids move from being in their really young elementary sort of levels here in sixth grade up to this notion of where they are at the start of high school, they tend to solidify in the types of roles they're engaged in. And my suspicion is this is going to become only more strong as we move on to kids that are in their high school years. And I'll know that for sure more shortly. All right, so I'm going to leave that apart. We have a bunch of stuff on what predicts movement from one place to the next. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a fair amount of this. One thing that's kind of an interesting finding, if you believe it, is that the leading crowd tends to be relatively stable. So once once females find their way into this role, they're very unlikely to leave it. And the thing that predicts getting popular, this is one of my favorite findings, is that if you're going to move from an outside position to a core position, deviancy predicts that, so you're about 40% more likely to make that move if you're deviant than if you're not. Similarly, if you go from one of these lieutenant positions, from an outsider to a lieutenant position. So you have these kinds of movements that can move you from the outside to the inside. And this fits lots of parents' fears, right? That if you think if your kid does deviant things, you're more likely to become one of these core positions. But it turns out that the other route into it is getting good grades, right? So and within these schools, either doing one or the other can get you in this kind of position. And this is exactly what we would expect to see given the lack of correlation with the behavior, with a particular behavior and your position in the school. All right. Over that. So the claim I want you to put in the back of your head quickly is that remember these roles are going to be a marker for a social identity. They're a way of interacting, a kind of a relational pattern that you're engaged in. That's distinct, from the kinds of people you interact with. Right, and so that would be your peer group. And so you can think about one of the things about all these adolescent schools is they tend to have these communities of kids that are close friends with each other. And some of those kids might be popular, they might be bridged to others, or they're not. But you have these different clusters of kids. We use a very simple Louvain style community detection algorithm. We augmented a little bit by not just identifying clusters, but identifying one's position as either core periphery within each cluster. And so this is whether or not you're a member of the largest Y-connected component, essentially within each cluster that's identified. And that gets us a little bit out of the boundary problem of cluster and community identification. So if a kid's a little bit on the edge of one or the other, it doesn't matter, because what we're really going to focus on is whether or not you're a core member, which tends to be more stable across different solutions of the clustering algorithm. We do that. What's interesting about being in groups is almost all of our kids are in groups, right? So about 95 to 90% of the kids are in a group as opposed to between groups. And the size of these groups tends to be about 10 or 11 kids. So there are some at the tail, so we do have some really large groups. And since our schools are getting bigger over time, the number of groups in any given school goes up. And this is going to speak to your point about what kinds of group kids sort in as the schools get bigger. Unlike, whoa, any idea what happened there? There we go. Unlike, there we are. Unlike roles, your attributes predict your group membership really well. So the first thing to keep in mind is that groups tend to be single sex, right? Particularly in 6th grade. As you move to 9th grade, you get a few groups that are cross-gender, but still the dominant mode of friendship groups are single sex. The likelihood that you and I are in the same group is well predicted by us engaging in the same behavior, right? So over time, if we're both, the likelihood of us both being in the same group by both receiving free lunch, for example, is strongly predictive. It could be instead of free lunch, that we both receive the same similar kinds of grades, or engage in drinking alcohol or smoking, right? So all of these things are nicely predicting whether or not we're going to be in the same group or not. So what this tells us then is that schools are highly clustered, right? That kids are in clusters with kids who are like them behaviorally, right? But they also occupy these roles that they're not like, right? And so this is the part of the story we're going to get to here at the end. We can model movement between groups, so the likelihood that a kid moves from one group to the next, but it's really difficult to do because you have this partitioning problem, right? So unlike roles, where I have a constant number and it's just a mobility table, I have to distinguish the problem of two groups merging from two groups splitting from a person just switching from one group to the next. And so the way we do this is we make a version, so this is what a group structure might look like over time. Right, so we identify groups that kids belong to in the 6th grade. As they move forward in time, some groups completely disintegrate. So this blue group split into lots of different settings, right? Where the orange group, by and large, remains constant, though some kids fly off into different places. And we'd like to be able to characterize settings by the movement from one set to the next. The solution we ended up using is a variant of the RAND index. All right, so we use a pair counting model that says that the likelihood that a group remains the same from time to time is a standardized function of the proportion of pairs at time 1 that are joined together at time 2 as well. The theoretical foundation of this is a distinction between a boundary consistency, the extent to which I say that you're not like me, and an internal consistency, the extent to which we're friends with each other. And those things, when those things are both strongly together, you get a very strong connection. When one of them or the other, you get splits, so you get fissions, or you get joining. So that's just how you define the RAND statistic. We have to deal with missing data. We're going to skip through some of that. These are stabilized. These are standardized Z-scores. This is how we this is a stability as a Z-score. We do it with a permutation method as opposed to a closed form because that was the only way we could solve it for this particular problem. The key to point out is that these are really big numbers, right? So by and large, groups tend to be pretty stable, more stable than the individual friendship nominations that make them up. So what predicts a group stability? Lots of different things. I'm just going to predict a couple of them here really quick to give you a sense. The key predictor is behavioral distance. So if you take something like the Mahalanobis distance, just the general behavioral distance between every pair of kids in the schools, the greater that distance, the less likely they are to be in the same group, for that group to remain stable. Similarly, the more gender heterogeneous a group is, the more likely it is to dissolve over time. The boundary consistency, which is the proportion of the relative outgroup ties compared to in-group ties, versus the internal cohesion, which is the node connectivity of the network. Both of those things strongly predict consistency. So if you have a group that has strong boundaries, like say economics and social science compared to sociology and social science, then you tend to have very strong stability. Whereas if you have lots of in-group contact, you also have lots of stability. And the so more popular groups are stable than less popular groups. I'm going to skip through some of these. That's not very interesting. We also have a version of this where we try to model why a person leaves a group or joins a group. And this is also difficult to measure because you have to think about whether or not a person leaves a stable group or joins an unstable group. And so we use the same kind of pair counting model that we go through. I'm more than happy to talk about that in detail if you're interested in it. But the basic insight is that we have different models for leavers than we have for joiners. And the logic here is that it means one thing to leave a band, it means something else entirely for the band to dissolve, right? And so that's the basic logic. And again, what we discover is that the more you're like the people in your group, the more likely you are to stay there, right? So the big story that comes out of all of this, and again, the more similar you are to everyone else in the group, the more likely you are to stay in that group. And the more central you are in the group, the more likely you are to stay in that group. Yeah. Yeah, so we just take... Yeah, so what we use is the Mahalanobis distance. So it's the Euclidean distance corrected for the correlation amongst the items. And so we just use that. So it's literally that score for each person relative to every other person in the school for the lever models. And so the more dissimilar I am to everyone else in my group, the less likely I am to stay in that group. So we used... We didn't use gender. We leave that out as a separate. We model that separately. But we used GPA. We used religiosity. We used a generalized substance use measure. We used school attachment. We used a connection to parents, whether or not they get school lunch. So a whole broad array of different kinds of behavioral features. Right. So in the end, all of these things matter in sort of the way you would expect. And so the ultimate story then, to wrap up in the interest of time, is I think two parts. At the global level, we have all this individual micro turnover, right? So we have lots of churning at the level of who nominates who in terms of individual ties. We have very little turnover in terms, but we still have this generalized structure, and so that's the mystery we're trying to explain. The individual popularity is not very stable, right? But role popularity is, or is becoming more stable. And so if you buy the idea that what it means to occupy a role is to engage in essentially a sociality identity, a way of being a friend, my argument is what's happening is that as kids develop over time, they're learning what kind of friend they are. So am I the kind of friend that prefers to pine after people who don't like me, or am I the kind of friend that likes to hang out with people who also like to hang out with me, right? And I think what's interesting about this is there's a very strong diversity of what kinds of friends people want to be, but it's something they seem to be settling on, sort of emerging, a role they're emerging into over time as they move from 6th grade to 9th grade. And that's what's keyed by this notion of being more stable. Now, what's important to keep in mind here is I don't think kids are actually cognitively aware that I'm going to be a lieutenant, right? They're doing this because we don't teach kids what it means to be a friend, right? We just let them figure it out on their own, and this is when they start engaging in behaviors to figure out what kind of kid they are. The kind of kids that used to being isolated on the outside and not engaged in others becomes academics. The kinds of kids who don't go on to be MBAs, right? And so you figured this out over time, sort of by happenstance. And you engage in a relational way of being, a way of interacting with kids, and you settle on that way of interacting. At the same time, you want to be around kids who are doing the same things that you're doing, right? You want to be around kids who are in groups engaged in the same kind of activities you are. And at this time period, those activities are rapidly changing. Right? Kids are deciding what kind of adult they're going to be or whether they can be an adult or not. And some of them are maturing much more faster, much more quickly than others. And so you have a disconnect between a stability in a type of action and an instability in the extent to which I'm going to engage in what the developmental folks refer to as adultifying behaviors. And so the extent to which there's heterogeneity in the likelihood that a kid will engage in adultifying behaviors, drinking, smoking, lying to their parents, what have you, really puts tensions on early groups, right? So if kids start maturing quickly, they're no longer like their friends that they were with in 6th grade, and so they find new friends that are more like them. But because there's heterogeneity in that developmental frame, right, there's lots of opportunities for groups to split. At the same time, kids are more likely to maintain the type of relationship they're at, and so this notion of local role patterns, more in-ties versus out-ties and so forth, remains stable. And so that allows us then to see lots of micro-mobility, lots of changes in the underlying who you're tied with, but not so many changes in the way you're tied to others. So combined in those two, it suggests an underlying micro model, which is that kids have a natural evolutionary sort of biological maturity rate that varies across the population. That maturity rate guides the kinds of behaviors they're engaged in, which guides who they're friends with. But as they grow older, they decide what kind of friend they're going to be, and so they're more or less tolerant of asymmetry in their relationships, which leads to the consistency in the overall hierarchy. At least that's the story we're hoping to go with. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you. Is that 45 minutes? Okay, great.
You stated we collect type of personality
Yes.
traits and things like that. And so is there any kind of correlation between personality traits and what kind of, for instance, person you want to be, right?
I haven't looked. The answer is yes and no. So the survey was collected in two parts. There's an in-school survey where all this came from, and there's an in-home survey. In the in-home survey, they do a full psychological battery, which includes all the big five and the rest of these. The problem is that's only done for about 40% of the sample. So I don't have it for all of the kids, and so I haven't looked at that part of the data as much. The things like a connection to parents and those kinds of measures, which aren't really personality measures, have the same lack of correlation. And so the honest answer is I don't know, but I would be worth looking at. Yeah, please. Yeah. Not here. No, we've not looked at differences between schools. The main difference between school that we want to pay attention to is the school mixture structure. So this movement from lots of elementary schools to one elementary school to one junior high to one high school. We expect that kind of essentially opportunity structure is going to make more difference in mobility than the other structures will. The good news is the vast majority of our schools are either one elementary to junior to not, or two elementaries into a single high school. So they know that one with 6 elementaries is an outlier. But there is some variability. About half of our settings have the 7th grade is considered part of the elementary school, and the other parts is considered part of the middle school. So that's a distinction that we think makes a big difference. Please.
Have you looked at the parents' status and their features to how that influences this?
Yeah, we've looked at it as best we can, which is this school lunch feature. So if you're the kind of kid that gets school lunch, then that's the only indicator we have of parental income or parental status. We don't know their education or whether they're like a boss in the local factory or something like that, or more importantly, probably whether or not they've been there their whole life, right? So if they're a townie versus a migrant, that would be a difference. But the notion, I don't know where that came from. But the notion of, so on a pure SES level, that seems to have no effect on the role, but a very strong effect on the group of friends you're with. Please.
Yes, I have a question. Is this self-reported agency or are you cross-reported?
This is all self-report. So kids are asked a series of a battery of the main purpose of the Prosper study was to measure an intervention on peer resilience to peer influence was the purpose, and so to stop kids from smoking, drinking, and so forth. So there's lots of detailed measures on how often you drink, how often you smoke, how much you smoke, whether you use marijuana or not, these kinds of things. A little bit of other deviant measures on things like, do you steal, do you lie, do you cheat, but it's all self-reported. Yeah.
And popularity, there's also that thought that if I just say that I do.
Maybe, though I think that kids are pretty well aware of what's going on with others, right? So if you're pretending, I think that kids are going to make you put up or shut up, right? So I think there's a fair amount of, so I think they might be lying to us, right? But I doubt that they're effectively lying to each other. In another paper, not this one, we look at the raw effect of popularity on the likelihood that you engage in substance use, right? So smoking, combined index of smoking, drinking, and marijuana use. And in that case, what we find was that the kids who are losing status, who are becoming less popular, start drinking more. And so we think this is actually a signal that they're using to say there's always a main effect. The more popular you are, the more you drink. But the kids who have a downward mobility in their popularity trajectory tend to engage in more drinking than those who even have upward mobility. We think this is because they recognize that drinking and smoking and doing these kinds of things gives them status. And in order to regain that status, we think they're going to sort of overplay their hand. At least that's the story we told. Please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the first question is about the role. You apply a block model,
Right.
and then you select the number of blocks based on
Right, within each school, right.
within each school.
Yeah.
Are you assuming that a role set is somehow defined by?
Yeah, I should be really careful here. It's not the modularity of the friendship network with that partition. It's the modularity of the similarities network, if the similarity matrix built on the role ties, right? So all I'm doing, the whole purpose of the block model partition is I want a set of kids who have essentially, in the ideal world, they would occupy the exact same distribution of triads or triad positions. Right, and so all we've done is take that similarity matrix, which is how similar is my triad profile to yours, and then calculate a valued version of modularity on that based by the partition. So the goal is literally to identify the set of positions that have the most common structures, with completely divorced of whether or not there's any within group friendship ties. Now I use modularity because I have it on my desktop and I'm a network guy and it's sort of handy. I could probably just as easily have used an SVD or a confirmatory factor analysis kind of model for that, because at that point the thing under the hood isn't really a network, it's a similarity matrix. And so any of your favorite dimensionality reduction techniques would be just fine. Right. Right. Yeah. So the question is, for groups, each kid is assigned to one group and only one group. Right. No, it's actually, I think actually it's ridiculous. And so this is why I rushed over this. It's a two-stage process. So what we do is we first come up with the best partition of groups. In this case, in the standard classic way of partitioning, where we're looking for in-group density relative to out-group density. And we use a mutually exclusive exhaustive clustering. So each kid is assigned to one and only clustered, and every kid is assigned to a group. But because I don't believe that that's actually right, we then go through for each kid and ask, if I remove the kid from this group, would it? It's essentially a Pareto optimal kind of model. Would it, in order for a kid to stay in a group, it has to be that there's no other group that it would improve the group that they would move to, or that they would leave in order for them to remain in that group. If that's the case, they stay in the group. If leaving a group would help another group more than it would hurt them, or would help the group I leave more than I left, then that kid's actually a betweener. And so those kids are said to be bridges between groups. And then there's a third class of kids that are on the periphery of any group. So they're only tied to one group, but they only have a single tie to that group, and so it's considered peripheral. So we try to get around this notion of kids who belong to multiple groups simultaneously by separating them out in this bridge position, which I skipped over in the discussion because I was going too fast. Ideally, I think what you would have is some of the new clustering types, and there are two that I really like. One are the hierarchical settings. So my guess is that there's actually a hierarchical nesting of kids. That when you move from groups, you don't move randomly to any other group in the set, but you move to groups for which there's some amount of familiarity, either behaviorally or not. And so very few kids radically go from being church-going, school-oriented, good grade-getting kids to drug-using deviants, right? And so they don't pop up immediately. Instead, they move to a group that's a little bit like the one they were from, but just a little bit different. And so my guess is that if we had a hierarchical nesting of groups, like the Oslam kind of model, that kind of model, I think, would create, you would see that there'd be a lot of sort of within community movement, where I might move from a local group to a different group, but it's within the collection of groups that are similar to each other. That would be my guess. So I really like those models. And I also like the models where you have kids that are allowed to be in parts of multiple groups. As we all know, the problem of being parts of multiple groups is it's really a pain in the ass to do anything with it from a modeling standpoint. So if I have it as an independent variable or anything else, it's hard to say, well, you belong to both groups. So you end up with cross loadings and cross nestings. And so we end up using the old style just because it was tractable. Really, and so then we came up with this ad hoc solution, which is the kids that would effectively contribute to the modularity of two groups. We just pulled them out entirely, so they're not a member of the group. They're in this special category called between groups. But if somebody, I have to admit, I have a love-hate relationship with groups. My wife has a joke, which is that It seems like 90% of my time is spent finding groups. And she's like, what are you doing today, Moody? I'm finding groups. And so she wishes I would just find a group, for crying out loud, and be done with it. But community detection is the Afghanistan of network analysis, right? It's really easy to get in, it's really hard to get out, and you never quite get out of it what you hope you did, right? So, I'm not entirely comfortable with the group setting we have, right? But I think what's nice about groups is that it's clearly the case that these networks are clustered. Right? So there's an obvious clustered structure to these groups. The modularity scores on the friendship networks are above 0.7 in almost all settings, right? And the groups are very coherent and they seem to make sense. But what would probably be better for most cases is to have something like the two-step neighborhood around kids and just individualize it as opposed to make it about which cluster they're in. But I think that it's hard to get away from the case. It's hard to distinguish, I think, our analytic intractability of the problem from the underlying reality of the setting, which is that these are clustered settings. And so kids belong to groups, they recognize groups, they name groups, they know what they are. And if you do the kinds of cognitive social structure mapping where you ask kids to assign kids to groups, there's high consistency across these groups, right? So there's lots of that's there. It's just that our ability to extract groups in a meaningful, non-arbitrary, sort of, non-controversial way is just difficult. So if anybody at NICO solves that problem, then that would be awesome. Please.
Popular sort of peer group. When it comes, I know that you have meeting sort of as sort of goal. Is that the role that everybody's trying to get in? There's certain. Does it have the same sort of like preference that are trying to get into that? No.
I think that if you were to ask kids, they would most likely, they're the two kinds of friends that they would like to be, would be the intimate, sort of what I call federated friends, small groups of intimate friends that we share things. And if you're friends with me, you recognize that I'm your friend and we have this high reciprocity and are sort of distinct. We could care less about the rest of the world, or sort of king of the world kind of positions. But I think actually kids don't have any clue about what role they're in this setting. I think that at that level, that things like, I want to be a member of the popular group where there are lots of kids that are engaged in popular activities, that's an attribute marker, and which is different from this very local level role position. The thing to keep in mind is that something like an aloof member, a kinds of kids that receives a lot more ties but doesn't send ties, isn't that I receive 6 and send 0. It's not. It's just that I receive a lot more than I send. So it's always a relative feature. And that relative feature, I think, just goes unrecognized by kids. I don't think they can see it as much as they are. And because I think this is one of the worst things we do to kids. We don't tell them what to expect, right? So we don't say it's not fair for your friends to make you the butt of the joke all the time and to leave you as the guy sort of running around to do everyone else's errands. I mean, this kind of I think kids are left to flounder their way into social identities at this level. And so we spend a lot of time saying, don't hang out with the druggies, don't hang out with these people, don't hang out with the people. And the more we say that as adults, the more cool that looks, the better it's at, and all these kind of things, right? And so I think that in some sense, we spend so much time speaking about the attributes and behaviors of groups as opposed to, things like reciprocity and trust and keeping secrets and being sort of a good friend, that part gets left aside. So my sense is that kids don't actually aspire to these things cognitively because they're not. My guess is they're not really aware of them in that way. But that's a hypothesis, right? So please.
So I know you haven't done an analytics yet, but what are your hypotheses? Multiple schools funneling into one versus straight path.
So our original hypothesis was that essentially that in small settings, we've done a little bit of work on this. And so our original hypothesis was that kids that are in small settings are essentially forced to be friends with people that are dissimilar from them because the school boundary is relatively arbitrary. It's a neighborhood based. And when I get into a bigger setting, I can do a finer sort on the kinds of behaviors and attributes and things that I like. And so we would expect to see that once the schools merge, the people drop friends quickly and become friends with the new people who are more like them than not. It turns out that that's somewhat true, but that there's a long and lasting sort of history that comes from having gone to elementary school. So if I went to elementary school with you in the same building, we're much more likely to be friends in 9th grade, even if we're even controlling for our distance on behaviors than we would be otherwise. Now, the problem, of course, is I don't really know what's driving that, right? So I don't know if it's because we went to school together, or if it's more likely because elementary schools are geographically assigned, that we ride the bus home and we're just exposed to each other more often. But there does seem to be an imprint of elementary school that I don't just abandon my elementary friends. I hang on to them into high school, even if they're a little more different than the people like me on other dimensions. But this is actually a feature that we've looked at it a little bit at the timing of the intervention. And it turns out that there's an interaction, a moderating effect of the timing of the intervention on its effectiveness by when schools merge. And I'm going to draw a blank because I didn't look this up recently, whether it's faster or sooner, but it suggests that there's an optimal time depending on what structure you're engaged in as to whether or not you do these interventions. The interventions were very mild. They were essentially training kids that essentially you're not going to lose your friends if you ignore their advice. But it had a huge effect on the network. So deviant kids became less popular in the treatment schools and the control schools, for example. There was a lower return to deviant behavior and friendship popularity over time. So it had an effect on the structure of the network that was unanticipated. Right.
How does the network explanation, so I'm assuming that there were other predictors also including outside of network.
Right.
How does the network component compare to the power of the other variables?
It's very hard. It's very powerful, and it was entirely unexpected. The way we got these data funded was it was largely an accident. What happened is they have an in-school intervention. It was set up through a psychology, sort of school psychology sort of framework, and it was all about individual peer resilience. So kids were sort of told how to be, resilient in the face of peer pressure. And there's lots of different specific programs where they all had that same theme. And so they were going to do the survey in school to get the kinds of behaviors they're engaged in and attributes. And they wrote up the survey, they get ready to go and realize they have a blank page on the back of the survey. Literally, like there was a blank page. And so Marc Feinberg, to his credit, who's been engaged with us on some other sort of networks, that said, look, can we do anything with that back page? And we said, let's just put a list and list your 7 closest friends on this back page and just write their name. And that's all it was. That's all it took, right? And so then we had to go scramble for money to hand code it because kids will write down their friends' names on the back page. But that's how we got the network data set. And it's been incredibly powerful. It's had both an interaction and moderating effect on the structure itself, but also it lets us see essentially one of my favorite findings on the intervention effect is that there's a strong diffusion of whether or not your kids. So if one of my friends got the in-home sort of intensive in-home intervention, it affects my behavior. And so there's and more importantly, there seems to be an effect that was done through the parents. So make sure I get this right. If my parents, for kids whose parents say they know most of their peers, that was an even stronger effect, right? So there was this sort of classic Coleman social closure effect that we expect to see. But we actually wrote a little editorial in one of the adolescent behavior journals saying, look, like it's if you're already doing a population survey, right? If you're already going to be saturating the sample, collecting the network data is trivial. And you're a fool not to do it. You got to do all the work. There's a whole cohort of graduate students at Penn State who went bleary-eyed matching names to rosters. But that side is hard work, but the actual data collection was easy. Please. Within groups, most groups have so the short answer is there's lots of variability in roles within groups. The vast majority of groups will have a handful of these roles. They're usually not big enough to have all of them. And so there's always some version of the federated friends within groups, which is usually the core group of people who are close to each other. And then essentially the group popularity determines whether or not you're more likely to be in something like the aloof group, which is on the outside, or one of the lieutenant groups. But there's a lot of role heterogeneity within each group. And this is what we would expect, right? And so you get these group of kids who are all engaged in the same kind of behaviors. You have a leader of that group, right? And that kid is receiving more ties than he or she is sending. But there's always more, so there's always some heterogeneity across the sets, but I don't have good number for you. All right. Thank you.